Does the Queen own all of the swans, and is she the only one allowed to eat them? This is a popular theory across the UK. It is mostly true, and there is actually a reason behind it that comes all the way from medieval England. Let's discuss the legality of things first. The Queen only owns unmarked mute swans in open water. Mute swans are a type of swan with the curved necks, who are not literally mute, but they're also just as annoying. The Queen's official title is Seigneur of the Swans, and the British Crown has held the right to claim ownership of swans since the 12th century. But why? It seems a little unnecessary now, but swans used to be a delicacy at banquets and feasts. Well, there used to be quite a lot of swan populations in England. In fact, 40 swans were presented for Henry III's Christmas celebrations in 1247. And in 1496, the secretary to the Venetian ambassador wrote that it was a truly beautiful thing to behold, 1,000 or 2,000 tame swans upon the River Thames. The Crown wanted to keep the use of swans as a commodity, not something for everyone to enjoy. And really the only way to keep things a commodity is to restrict access. So it was an order that only the monarchy could own swans, have a license to hunt swans and serve them at their feasts. The Crown could actually grant rights for others to own swans as well, so only very few people could also hunt and eat swans. Therefore, they became a huge commodity. They became a luxury status symbol. Basically, serving a swan at your feast was like today's driving around in a Bugatti. Owning the right to swans demonstrated nobility, or at least deep connections to nobility. Either that or you poached it illegally and will be sent to jail. During the reign of Elizabeth I, a German traveller-writer, Paul Hentzner, described swans living in great security, nobody daring to molest, much less kill any of them, under penalty of a large fine. Those who were granted ownership also had to pay specifically for a certain swan mark to use to note their ownership. These marks were actually the oldest proprietary mark in England. They stopped this practice in the late 19th century when Queen Alexandra, the wife of King Edward VII, spoke against the unnecessary cruelty. Any swans that didn't bear a mark were the property of the Crown, and so only the rich owned and ever ate swans, keeping them as a luxury good. Local councils actually had swan moots, which were swan courts that heard cases related specifically to swan ownership and disputes. This was serious stuff. In 1570, the Order of the Swans was published, setting out the rules, noting that if any person do raise out, counterfeit, or alter the mark of any swan, they shall suffer 1 year's imprisonment. Now, it wasn't that the swan itself was so tasty that it was worth it. It was more the presentation of the fact that you could afford to have a swan, or even swans just living in your pond. We could compare it to driving your Bugatti around town without having anywhere to go, or leaving it in the driveway for people to see, even though there's room in your garage for it. Swans became an elegant symbol of the Crown, something so elite that the average person would not interact with one at all. It was illegal to sell them, to mark them, to injure them, hunt them, or even drive them away from your land. All you could do was watch them as they float down the river and run away from them when they tried to attack you. It was only during the Victorian period that swan as a dish went out of fashion. So owning swans really became purely a status symbol and no longer for any purpose whatsoever. By this time, swan populations were in trouble, especially in the 1900s due to pollution and the more active use of rivers and canal systems. Today, killing or injuring a swan can be classed as criminal damage, as they are technically still the Queen's property. But it is no longer treasonous to eat a swan since 1998. But wild swans are also protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981, meaning it is still illegal, just not treasonous. So, is the Queen the only one allowed to eat swans? As she is immune from prosecution, so technically, yes, the Queen is the only one who can legally eat a swan, but she doesn't really need that kind of rumour going around. There are a fair few traditions across the world that really do seem unnecessary in the modern world, and are certainly more visual displays of history than serving any purpose. One such tradition is known as the annual Swan upping in July. The Queen has a swan warden who is charged with counting all of the mute swans on the Thames between a 79-mile stretch that takes about 5 days to navigate, and a marker of the swans, whose job it is to check the markers of all the swans not owned by the Queen. To do this, a group of the Queen's swan uppers row down the River Thames in traditional wooden rowing boats, counting every single swan that they come across. Today, they do use these numbers to track conservation efforts for protection of these swans, but you have to think that there's a bit of an easier way to do this. At least when they do count the population, they make an effort to weigh and inspect the swans for injury, so it's basically their annual physical checkup. Unfortunately, this year the swan upping had to be skipped, so the swans are probably wondering where all the weird annoying people in the boats are. The Crown only really informally recognises ownership of the swans in a section of the Thames River and around Windsor, rather than the whole open waters of the country. So they've only been keeping their eyes on the ones in the Thames, where the population went down from 1,300 in 1960 to just 7 pairs of birds in 1985. They are threatened mainly by pollution, predators, non-native species, and dog attacks. But conservation work is continuing, and thankfully the swan populations are rising again. In fact, they counted 134 in 2016. So there we have the truth behind the royal ownership of swans. What started as a horrible system of marking and claiming ownership of wild swans and making an animal a commodity has turned out in fact to be a positive way to protect and preserve the swan population all across the UK, and to carry on some weird traditions to count them on every year. And as an extra fact to add on, the Queen also owns dolphins, or any dolphins that swim close enough to the UK. An order from 1324 states that the King shall have whales and sturgeons taken in the sea or elsewhere in the realm, which extends to dolphins and porpoises too. So the definition of any royal fish within the 3 miles of the coastline or on the shore technically belongs to the Queen. It's amazing how many of these weird rules from the 14th century were passed and still have power today. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe so you can see me again for the next Chit Chat history. And goodbye for now.